Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. The return of Donald Trump to the White House has been top of mind for many people in early 2025, and not just in the US, for understandable reasons. But for Trump's administration, or at least those people in it who try to think strategically about what policy approach would be best for boosting the influence of the US state and the competitiveness of US multinational corporations, just as it was for Biden's administration, what the US does in relation to China is a top concern. Friction between the US and to varying degrees other Western states on the one hand, and China on the other, is ongoing. Just think in the US of the TikTok ban, tariffs on Chinese-made EVs, and sharp disagreements over Taiwan. This rivalry isn't going away. How it unfolds is going to have huge effects on people around the world. So this brings up the question of how the left should understand it and how we should act in relation to it. So to discuss these questions, I'm joined by Eli Friedman, who's one of the 4 co-authors of the book China in Global Capitalism, Building International Solidarity Against Imperial Rivalry, which was published in 2024 by Haymarket. So could you introduce yourself and tell listeners a bit about the book and about some of your other books on China?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. So that's right. I teach at Cornell University, and I'm in the Department of Global Labor and Work. I've been doing research and work and activism in China for more than 20 years now. I started going there as a university student and have stuck with it for quite a long time, and have been interested in a variety of questions related to the social and political consequences of China's capitalist transformation, which began in the 1980s and really accelerated in the years after. I've looked at this from a number of different perspectives. I've written about rural to urban migration and the kinds of social services that the children of rural to urban migrant workers receive, specifically with reference to education. I've written about strikes and the way that the state, and particularly the official trade union federation, deals with the question of wildcat strikes, which are quite common in China. You mentioned the most recent book that I've co-authored with Haymarket, but I helped to translate and edit a book that came out with Haymarket in 2016 called China on Strike, which is a really wonderful volume. It is translations of first-person narratives of workers' participation in strikes, and it deals with the nitty-gritty of how strikes are organized in a context where there's no unions, where there's no right to strike or collective bargaining. But inevitably, it touches on all kinds of issues related to workers' daily lives, personal struggles, as well as questions of repression and the union and all of that. So focused on quite a number of things. And last year, my co-authors and I wrote this book called China in Global Capitalism. And this was an effort to talk about China, to introduce it to leftists who are outside of China. Of course, we're writing in English, so our target is mostly the Anglophone countries. A bit of a bias, I would say, towards the United States, since all 4 of us are currently based in the U.S. Two of my co-authors were born and raised in China and are now living in the U.S. But I think that the issues that we look at are broadly relevant in the Western world and beyond. And we had to make some very hard decisions in the book because China's big, complicated. Its relationship to the United States, to other Western powers, and global capitalism is complex. But we ended up focusing on the issues that we thought were most salient for a leftist understanding of China. And of course, with an orientation towards thinking about action and practical engagement. And even for those of us who are not going to drop everything that we're doing in our own countries and move to China to try to organize the working class or anything like that, what are the things that we can do in our own communities and our own countries to try to create a less destructive dynamic in terms of the relationship with China, and most optimistically, how we can work towards building internationalist solidarity with Chinese people.
Thanks for that. I can certainly recommend the book to listeners. It's really good. So, Eli, the episode is called U.S. Capitalism versus Chinese Capitalism. But some people, both on the left and the right, would say, hey, China's not capitalist. So, could you respond to that idea, maybe starting by people on the so called free market right who would be denouncing what they would call Chinese communism and saying it's not capitalist, and then move on to talk about the pro China left?
Yeah. Well, it's a funny issue because if you look at what the people who run China are saying, they're saying we're not capitalist, we're socialist. It is a one-party state governed by the Communist Party, and they think of themselves as being in competition with the sort of the US-led Western order, which is capitalist. So if you take it at face value, you might come to the reasonable conclusion that they're socialist. The thing that I always encourage people to do is to approach the things that the Chinese state says about itself with the same degree of criticism, sort of a critical perspective that you might when Joe Biden says the United States is a democracy and we always stand for, for freedom and democracy and the rules-based international order everywhere around the world. Those of us on the left will look at Joe Biden saying that and say, okay, well, it's significant that he chose that as his political rhetoric. But we're not necessarily going to say the United States, therefore, is always promoting democracy everywhere it goes. And the same thing, I think, is true when it comes to China. They have political rhetoric. There's internal politics that are oftentimes difficult for people to understand. But there is a reason why Xi Jinping invokes socialism, invokes Marxism, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what we might say from an analytical perspective constitutes a kind of a real socialist society or economy. Now, as you said, there's different ways of thinking about this. People on the right will say, they'll even sometimes still refer to Red China, although that is a bit archaic. But frequently, you'll hear people refer to it as communist China, as if there is a non-communist China somewhere out there. And for them, I think that this is mostly a way to designate China as an enemy of the United States and of Western countries more broadly, because we know from the history of the Cold War that all you have to do is say communist, and you understand that there's something insidious going on here that is against American values, that is against liberty, freedom, etc. Right? I think for most people who are using that kind of rhetoric, it's not much deeper than that. There are some times where it might have something to do with the role of the state and say, well, in Western liberal democracies, we believe in a free economy, that the government shouldn't be picking winners and losers, and that we should let the free market, work its magic. In most respects, the government is there just for sort of policing, for enforcing contracts, and a kind of minimalist liberal state. So I think for some on the right, that is part of what's going on. With respect to the left, I think it's it's more complicated. And again, I do want to acknowledge that the state refers to itself as socialist. That is important. There is also the legacy of the Chinese Revolution, which in and of itself is a huge, huge topic. We touch on it in the book, but actually don't spend much time talking about the Maoist era, which lasted from 1949 up until 1976. But it is important to acknowledge that from beginning of the 1930s and throughout the Maoist era, that Maoism was seen as something of a beacon by many activists and revolutionary movements, many of which the left, I think, justifiably supported in many parts of the world, right? I mean, you have Maoist students in Western university campuses in the 1960s and 1970s, but you also have revolutionary movements in many places around the world, and still today, right? You have Naxalites in Eastern India who themselves, are inspired by a Maoist vision of revolution that is most importantly rooted in the idea that a peasantry can lead a revolution. And so, of course, that has a lot of appeal in the third world, aka the global south. Those are real things that I think have to be contended with and acknowledged. I think we also have to have our eyes open to what has happened in China over the last 40 years, which is a pretty dramatic reversal of all the things that happened in the Mao era. Whether or not we think that what happened in the Mao era was great or not, and I think that there are lots of things that can be criticized for that period of time too, pretty much all of the major interventions that the Maoist state was promoting have been undone. First and foremost, beginning in the late 1970s, we have the decollectivization of land, right, and the return of land to individual holders, and the treatment of land more or less like a commodity. We have the creation of labor markets and the commodification of labor. We have the rise of private enterprise. And we can go into more detail about each of those and why I think it makes sense to think of China as capitalist. But I think that for many people, there is a kind of nostalgia for the Mao era and what it represents, and a hope that whatever kind of, kernel of socialism that's still there contained within the Communist Party or within the state itself, that can be resurrected to lead some kind of socialist transformation. I would say that one other thing that is for some parts of the left might be appealing about the Chinese state is simply that it's confronting American imperialism. And there's no question about that China presents a challenge to American imperialism. And I think the task for us is to have an assessment about whether that is a challenge to American imperialism that we see as liberatory or not. Our answer is very clearly it is not. Which is not to say that we therefore embrace American imperialism. Those are not the only two choices in the world, and our answer is that we need another way. That we would actually need some kind of genuine socialist project, which would have to be opposed to both of these powers, which of course is an immense task at the present moment.
Thanks for that. So if we start from the understanding then that China is capitalist, we have to recognize that Chinese capitalism, or capitalism in China, is not identical to capitalism in the form that it exists in the so-called West, or for that matter, as it exists in India or Russia or a number of other places we could name. So how would you identify what's distinctive about how capitalism is organized in China?
Yeah, so sometimes when people are thinking about capitalism, they're just imagining it's the sort of Anglo-liberal model, and that is capitalism. Any deviation from that means maybe it's not capitalism. I think if you look at the history of capitalism, even in North America and Northwestern Europe, we can see lots of different kinds of variations. And given that variation, China certainly belongs within this broad categorization. So first, let me talk a little bit more about why I think China ought to be considered capitalist, and then we can talk about the ways in which it is significantly and importantly, I think, different from certainly the Anglo-American version of that. China's capitalist first and foremost because the overwhelming majority of people in that society have to sell their labor in order to survive. This is a basic understanding of what constitutes a capitalist society. People are proletarianized. That's the only way that they can survive. They can't survive by living on collectively owned land, by working in publicly owned enterprises that guarantee them employment. They do not have guaranteed access to the means of social reproduction, housing, healthcare, etc. The way you access the things that you need to survive in China is via wages. You go out, just like in whatever country we live in, because it's every country on earth at this point. You go out, you get a job, you earn money, and you use that money to buy the things that you need to survive, including your clothes, including your house, including, importantly, healthcare. Healthcare is quite commodified in China, although there are some public subsidies, as there are in many capitalist countries. So that's the fundamental thing. Some of the ways that I think people get hung up on this question about China being capitalist versus socialist come to the important differences. Now, the first important difference that most people will point to is the role of the state in the economy. And under Xi Jinping, the Chinese state made a very clear decision to step back from some of the more extreme kind of neoliberal tendencies that we saw under Jiang Zemin, which were somewhat, he was in power until the early 2000s. And then the subsequent leader, Hu Jintao, was in power from 2002 to 2012. Hu began to temper some of that. Under Xi Jinping, we see what is referred to as the kind of advance of the state. And so there's a clear decision that the commanding heights of the economy are going to remain state-owned enterprises. And the percentage of China's economy that is in the state sector is large compared to other capitalist countries. It's around a third of the economy, somewhere between 25 and 30%, depending on how you account for it. And that is much larger than it is in the United States or in Canada or the UK. It is not that much higher than other countries, which nobody debates are capitalist, right? So if you look at France at kind of the peak of state interventionism in the 1970s, it was about a quarter of the economy that was in the state sector. Similarly, in Nehru's India, you had a similar sort of proportion of the economy that was in the state sector. Even in Taiwan, right, which is oftentimes counterposed as the capitalist China, if you look in the 1980s, it was about 28% of the economy. It was either 25 or 28% of the economy that was in the state sector. So historically, many places that don't generate any debate about whether these are capitalist or not have a similar percentage of the economy that is owned by the state. I think a follow-up question, though, if we're just looking at this kind of headline number and we see, okay, 20, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the economy is in the state sector, the more important question for socialists is to ask, what does this mean from the perspective of the working class? Does the working class have meaningful control over the means of production, right? Just a kind of classical understanding of what socialism means. And the answer in China is absolutely they do not. That although you still have state-owned sector, you still have these state-owned enterprises, there is still wage labor. One of the main things that we've seen from the 1990s on is that state-owned enterprises have gained the legal right to hire and fire people. Workers tend to have somewhat greater job protections in the state sector than they do in the private sector. But just because, let's say you're in the United States and you work for the UAW with a union contract, you also have somewhat better protections than would be the case for someone who works at Walmart. We don't say, therefore, that the UAW worker, because they have these protections, is working in socialism. And when it comes, I think, to clearing a somewhat higher bar for thinking about socialism, which is to say that the people who are producing things have meaningful say over the organization of production itself, there's no question. These are dictatorial organizations in the same way that capitalist firms are. And significantly, and there's a reason for all of that, because one of the decisions that the Chinese state has made in maintaining these large state-owned enterprises is that they want them to compete in the global marketplace, right? So if you look at the Fortune Global 500, at least 3 of the top 10 firms are Chinese state-owned firms. You have the State Grid, and then you have the 2 petroleum and oil companies, Sinopec and PetroChina. They're out there, they're competing with the European, with the American, et cetera, private oil companies. And so when you're facing that kind of coercive pressure of the global market, if they want to compete, they have no choice but to treat their workers as more or less disposable commodities. So, the fact that these enterprises are state-owned doesn't really impress me that much when it comes to thinking about them as socialist. And the final, I think, big important topic with respect to this question of China and socialism that sometimes gets people hung up is the question of the ownership of land. So sometimes people will say there's no private property, there's no private land ownership in China. That is true in a very narrow and technical sense. What happened in the reform process beginning in the 1980s is that in places that are designated rural, the land was decollectivized so that farmers have long-term leases to particular plots of land, and that the collective owns the rights to the property underlying it. And in urban areas, the land is still nominally owned by the state. Now, that is true, that is important for understanding land politics in China, but significantly, it does not prevent that land as being treated as if it were a commodity. If you're in a rural area and you're a farmer and your family has a 50-year lease, what you can do is you can exchange the use rights to that land while you have that lease, right? And this is something that the state has encouraged. And one of the consequences of this in many places is that we see the consolidation of agricultural land by agribusiness, because they go and they buy up these lands and they put together big plots of land to allow them to get efficiency gains in output, right? And frequently what we see is that not having property rights is actually worse, because you'll see corruption at the level of the state in collusion with developers who will come in, and the head of the village collective will essentially say, I speak on behalf of the collective, The developer hands them a suitcase of cash, and they'll say, we'll sell you the use rights to this land at some price way below the market value, and the developers get access to land for cheap. And there's good studies that show that people are getting way below market value for their land. So the fact that it's nominally collectively held doesn't actually serve social need. In urban areas, it's a similar sort of a thing. The state owns, yes, they own land, but what they do is they'll give long-term leases to developers. So they'll say, okay, this developer has a 99-year lease on this plot of land. And on top of that, we're going to build private apartment buildings, right? And so the people own their particular units in that building. They don't own the surface of the earth underneath it, but those apartments can be bought and sold on the market. And China had for a very long time one of the largest real estate bubbles in the history of civilization. It is now in the process of being deflated to catastrophic ends that has mostly negatively affected construction workers and poor and middle class people. But that's another story. In any event, it's very clear that from the perspective of society, what does society need? Society needs people need a place to live. If you're going to get a place to live, it's still being mediated by the market. And housing, which is the reason why we care about land, housing and agriculture, that is not being provided to people as a matter of course.
Anything else you want to add about what's distinctive about capitalism in China?
Well, I do think that there is more state intervention than you would see in your average liberal context, right? So one of the things that we've seen in recent years was heavy intervention in the tech sector, right? So the United States has the world's leading tech sector, which is, I think, famously and disastrously unregulated. And that has allowed for the construction of these massive monopolistic companies that now also exercise huge political power. China saw what was happening in Silicon Valley, and they made a decision, which I think is a wise decision, that they didn't want to allow their tech companies, which are the only ones in the world that really can compete with those from the United States, and they really brought them to heel. And in a sense, that is a positive development. They prevented them from developing a kind of an autonomous political base of power. If you think about this again from the question of social need, it had no positive implications for the workers in these tech companies, which are notoriously brutal employers, be they programmers or be they, the food delivery people working for apps. And in terms of the content of what of what tech companies are doing, they're not serving socially positive ends. We know this from TikTok, which is, we can debate about whether TikTok ought to be banned or not in the United States. But if you go on TikTok, it's not like this is serving some kind of like socialist end, right? It's doing the same thing that Twitter might be doing, or that Facebook or Instagram. They have a slightly different algorithm, but they're trying to get your attention and to get you to buy stuff. And the same is true with Shine or Temu, these companies that have taken over the world recently, Alibaba. All these companies they're trying to sell you things. And so fundamentally, the orientation of those tech companies is to generate profit via the market. And so in that sense, I don't see it as being any different. The way they regulate the finance industry is also a little bit different than it would be in London or New York. But I think that they're maybe gaining some more stability in financial markets. But the idea that the state is regulating finance in order to divert investment to socially progressive ends rather than just a kind of a somewhat more sane approach to regulating the relatively unregulated movement of finance capital. Like I just don't see a fundamental distinction there.
Thanks. So let's move out, and I'm going to ask you if you could maybe paint us a picture of China's place within global capitalism and how it's changed. We're going back maybe to the end of the 1970s. And then moving from there to talking about its place in the world economy today, and any thoughts you might have about the direction that it's heading.
Sure. I mean, it's changed so much in the span of just over 40 years. So if you go to the late 1970s, early 1980s, China's engagement with global capitalism was very, very minimal, right? There was some trade in the state socialist era, initially with the Soviet Union and later with some other countries, but it was still quite minimal. And so when they entered, the strategy was essentially to bring in foreign technology, to bring in foreign investment, and they clearly identified their major comparative advantage as having a large, cheap, highly disciplined, and politically repressed working class. And so they could bring in investment from many places, especially from East Asia. Actually, Western powers, in terms of direct investment in China, were only kind of came in later and still were not nearly as significant as capital from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, especially, but also from South Korea and Japan. So in some ways, this is really a kind of an East Asian story, although the commodities that they're often producing were for Western brands and were for consumption in Western countries. East Asia as well, but Western countries were particularly important. And so at that moment, they were low on the value chain, right? They were just throwing a huge amount of cheap labor and also cheap land, which again could be acquired without paying market price to those peasants who could be kind of dispossessed of their land, and producing goods at the kind of the bottom tiers of these global supply chains for export. So that was the initial strategy, and it worked incredibly well. And over the course of the 1990s, and especially after WTO entry in 2001, China became the workshop of the world, as it came to be known. This was very socially disruptive for lots of places. And one of the kind of social bases of Trumpism is, of course, the relocation of industrial might from the United States to many countries, but most importantly to China. And similar sorts of things have happened in other Western countries, as well as East Asian countries. But they began moving up the value chain, right? Because they weren't satisfied with making t-shirts and cheap toys and things like that. And so they began moving into more higher value added kinds of commodities, things that required more capital, that required a more highly educated workforce, into machine tools, into significantly automobiles, into electronics. China continues to be the most important electronics manufacturer in the world. And so you have that kind of second phase that you can really see developing in the 2000s, where they're capturing more of that high value added stuff, but they're still nowhere close to the apex of the value chain. But they're making smart kinds of investments. And one of the things that China does, which is really important for understanding its industrial transformation, is when foreign capital comes in, the state wants to ensure that there's a transfer of technology and that there's a transfer of intellectual property. Now, a lot of Western corporations are complaining about intellectual property theft and all of that. But in many cases, they do it completely knowingly, because China says, look, if you want access to our market, which is the largest market in the world, and which has a growing number of middle-class consumers, this is just the price that you have to pay. And a lot of companies do that, notably car companies. So Volkswagen's been there since the late 1970s, but every major European and American brand has assembly plants in China. Tesla has a plant that didn't open until I think it was 2019. So when it comes to auto, and also when it comes to electronics, Apple is of course the major investor there. There's an understanding that they're going to be transferring some of their technology. And for a while, you don't really see the consequences of that. But really, in the last several years, we've begun to see the most recent stage, which is that there has been a lot of transfer of technology and of intellectual property, and that has gone to indigenous companies within China. And so now you see Chinese companies competing at the high end of the value chain. So Apple is now facing competition from companies like Xiaomi, like Huawei. These are companies that are producing phones that are similar in quality to Apple iPhones, but are much, much cheaper. There's been a lot of news coverage recently about China's auto industry. And the thing that allowed them to make the great leap was going straight to EVs. And so BYD, I believe, is now the biggest EV seller in the world, having overtaken Tesla. And those kinds of things wouldn't have happened without the presence of these foreign corporations. But this does mean, and this is really relevant for where you started about this competition between China and the United States. For the first time, Western corporations and Japanese corporations are seeing China not just as a place to outsource low-end production to save on labor costs, but as real competitors, both within China. And foreign auto companies have really been cut out of the Chinese market. They've seen rapidly diminishing market share. But also in many other places around the world, notably the global south. where Chinese commodities are much more competitive because they tend to be quite cheaper. And in terms of quality, they're oftentimes very similar, or in some cases surpassing what you can get from a Western or a Japanese brand. And so that's the phase that we've been in for the last few years. That has been a result of a concerted effort on the part of the state, and it's being led by private corporations. I think it should be emphasized. State enterprises are sometimes upstream suppliers to these private companies, but the big companies, again, Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo are doing phones, and BYD, Geely. There's other less famous auto companies. Those are all private corporations, and now they are competing on a global stage.
I think it's worth underlining just how fast this has happened. I mean, if you look at the perspective of world history, it's really quite extraordinary to think that from China's entry into the World Trade Organization to the present, just what a dramatic shift there's been.
I mean, it's incredible. It is, in the span of less than a generation. And this is not the first time these kinds of things have happened. And I think you can go back a generation or two and look at the way Western corporations dealt with the rise of Japanese corporations, right? So in the 1950s, in the 1960s, General Motors and Ford were not worried about Japanese cars, right? By the 1980s, they really had to be worried about Japanese cars. And by the 1990s, they had adopted Japanese methods of production, right? And so, this is not the this is not the first time. And Japanese electronics, frankly, wiped out American supremacy in that field. I mean, who thinks of RCA as they're not a leading kind of electronics producer anymore, right? So Japanese corporations did that before. Of course, there's a very different geopolitical relationship between Japan and the US-led Western order than there is between China and the US-led Western order, and so that creates some different kinds of political dynamics. And also, if you look at what happened, I mean, the United States in the 1980s was very worried about Japan, and through the Plaza Accords in 1985, forced a revaluation of the currency, basically kneecapping Japan's economic development. And we all know what happened after that. The 1990s was the so-called lost decade for Japan, and in some ways, they didn't fully recover from that. So we see similar sorts of dynamics, but now the United States is not in a position to force China to kind of do its bidding in the same way.
Could you just touch on perhaps what you see as the major obstacles that Chinese capital faces as it's going into this newer phase?
The major obstacle that it faces is opposition, not just from the United States, but from many countries. The news just yesterday was that China had the biggest trade surplus I think it's ever had. I forget what it was, over $1 trillion or something. And so there's these massive trade imbalances, and they're being absorbed first and foremost by the United States, but also by lots of other countries, right? So, in 2016, when Trump gets elected and he's going around saying we're going to put tariffs on China, people are kind of thinking of this as like, oh, this is some sort of aberration from the neoliberal order, and Trump is like, he's got some weird fixation on tariffs. I don't want to give him any credit, but if you look at what's happened over the last few years, it is not simply the man Trump that kind of embodies this problem. That there are many countries around the world that are seeing this influx of Chinese commodities and are very anxious about it, right? And so it includes, now the EU has put, I believe, a 25% tariff on Chinese EVs. It was something that, in sort of a complex way, their own European auto manufacturers actually opposed, I think, because they didn't want to get shut out of the China market. But in any event, the EU did that. Japan and Australia have their own trade conflicts with China. South Korea is very concerned about their dominance, increasing dominance actually in auto as well as microprocessors and steel and shipbuilding. These are areas that they compete in. And so, the effect of this is that for the established economic powers that are already heavily invested in these areas that China is trying to challenge them in, it's a real problem, right? And even in some developing countries, frankly. And so I think, the political challenge that they face is, can they find some way to ensure that this rise is accommodated by the established powers? So that's with relationship to the more economically powerful states. To the less economically powerful states, China has to give them some reassurance that they're not just going to wipe out those states' desires to industrialize, right? And you can see this in lots of places. China's desire for natural resources has, of course, skyrocketed over the past generation. First for building cities, but also for a lot of industry. So getting iron ore, getting copper, getting cobalt, which is a really important ingredient in a lot of electronic green technologies. This has brought them in kind of a classical imperialist dynamic to many places in the global south. And so China is the biggest investor in mining in places like Indonesia, in the DRC, in Peru. And there's some practices that look, frankly, a little bit colonial, where they're doing natural resource extraction and they're taking them back to China, and the overwhelming majority of value is being captured back in China as kind of a new metropole. So what are they going to do for places like the DRC? Can they make investments that might catalyze some sort of process of industrialization there, rather than just extracting natural resources and bringing them back to China to batteries that will allow BYD to become the world's largest, automaker? So I think that there's different kinds of concerns for different places in the global system.
Anything you'd like to add about major obstacles facing China, Chinese capital within China?
Yeah, so the big problem within China, something that has been clear for 20 years now, is underconsumption. And if you look at the constitution of China's economic growth, it is overwhelmingly driven by exports and by investments. Investments for a long time in real estate was really, really driving the economy. That's come down in recent years as the bubble has slowed, but investments in all kinds of infrastructure. Now, investments in infrastructure can be a good thing. Certainly, as an American, we wish that we had better infrastructure, roads that weren't full of potholes and functioning public transport and things like that. And China has made some really admirable advances there. They have also done a lot of overinvestment. The high-speed rail network, which has gotten a lot of coverage and is a really great thing for getting people off the roads and ensuring road safety and things of that nature. They've also built lines in places that probably don't deserve them, given the number of people that are living there, especially amid a shrinking population. And so there's a question from a purely economic standpoint. They definitely made some overinvestment. The thing that they've identified, you can go back and see in 2003 that Premier Wen Jiabao was talking about this in 2003, saying China's development has become unbalanced. And the thing that we have to do to address that is to increase domestic consumption. So we're less reliant on consumers in the West, and we'll be less reliant on this kind of debt-driven investment internally. And they've made no progress on it, right? So they've been talking about it for 20 years and they failed to do it. There's a lot of reasons behind this, but I think that from my perspective, one of the most important things is that they don't really have a mechanism for essentially a class compromise, right? To ensure that more of the benefits of growth end up in the pockets of workers. And there's various ways that you can do that. One is to increase wages. You probably need a labor movement to do that in a systematic way, and the state is quite categorically opposed to the emergence of any kind of labor movement. You need massive increases in social spending. China's made some great strides in social development, but the big strides actually happened in the Mao era, if you look at literacy and health and things like that. And there have been continued to be some improvements since then, but we don't see big, ambitious spending. There's no national healthcare system. Most people in China have very shoddy health coverage. The pension system is in shambles. People do not feel like they can, most people, I should say, it's uneven geographically. They don't feel like that they have a pension that they can count on for retirement. And so given those kinds of uncertainties that people face with respect to social welfare, they're reluctant to spend a lot of money now because they feel like they have to save that money away. So China's a very high savings rate. So, I see this as fundamentally as a political problem. If the state identifies it as a problem and they can't address it, why is that happening? And despite the increasing ascendance of China's corporations, you have to ask, to what extent is this benefiting the people who live in China, right? BYD is creating some jobs. They're generally not very good jobs. The tech giants are not creating very many good jobs. They're creating a lot of quite bad jobs in platform delivery, Shine and Temu are dependent on a whole network of super exploitative garment production, particularly in South China. And so that fundamental problem of underconsumption within China continues to be a problem, and that's connected to the global problem. Because if they're not, if the things that are being produced in China are not being consumed in China, then they have to find an outlet somewhere, which means they're being exported, which brings us back to the problem that we were just talking about China having these huge trade surpluses, which is now creating all of this political friction with countries around the world.
So this brings me to the question, as you say, friction. If you could identify what you think the key areas are for economic and political conflict between the U.S. and China, because this is something which is affecting all of us and is going to continue to be a major influence on the world in the years ahead. But what are the major flashpoints that you see?
Well, the major economic flashpoints clearly will be what we've just been discussing, which is the question of trade surpluses, trade imbalances. Trump is very unpredictable. He didn't run on a platform of annexing Greenland, and yet here we are, or Canada for that matter. So we don't really know what he's going to do with respect to China, aside from the fact that he really likes tariffs. And so he will absolutely threaten tariffs. Joe Biden kept basically all the tariffs that Trump had put in his first term. And so tariffs are already very high. They could be raised still further. So that's one thing that we'll have to definitely keep an eye on and how that gets negotiated. The other thing about Trump, of course, is that he's very transactional. And if it can be presented as a personal victory for him, I think he will probably take it. If you look at the so-called round one agreement out of the first trade war, I guess the first agreement came in 2019. The big win that Trump got for America was better access to financial markets for American financial institutions so that they could sell products like mutual funds to Chinese investors, right? So did that make America great again? Like, clearly no. It didn't even do the thing that I think he talks about all the time, which is about the trade imbalance. It's not going to affect the trade balance at all to allow American financial institutions to sell products to Chinese consumers. But he could claim it as a victory. And of course he did. So, hard to predict, but certainly that will continue to be an issue. With respect to politics, of course, the most volatile question is around Taiwan. And that is also very difficult to predict. The Chinese government has become much more hostile. There was a period of time in the 2000s where it kind of looked like maybe they could affect some sort of peaceful, if not reintegration, some sort of an arrangement where people in Taiwan would accept a symbolic relationship with China, although that's a very complicated issue. And over the last 20 years, Taiwanese people have increasingly rejected closer ties with China, and the response from China has been a real militarization of the Taiwan Strait. They are regularly sailing warships, not just kind of near the island, but around the island, and that's a new development, something that they didn't do before, and regularly flying fighter jets into Taiwanese airspace, including over the island. And they've invested a lot. The military modernization has proceeded very quickly. Now, the relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan is complicated. We don't have formal diplomatic relations, but certainly the United States doesn't want to see Taiwan be annexed by the PRC. How Trump will deal with that is very complicated. And I should say that this is also not just a U.S. issue, that South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines are all also very concerned about all of this and have themselves demanded more U.S. military intervention in the region, Australia as well. So it's not just a U.S.-China issue, it's a kind of a regional kind of a question. And that one does make me nervous. I think it can be managed. I don't think war is inevitable, but the kind of mercurial nature of Donald Trump makes it such that mistakes could be made, and that could lead to potentially catastrophic situations. So that's the big one. There's other things around the world. Increasing competition, I would particularly in Latin America, is a big concern for the United States because that is the traditional backyard of American empire. You see that even with Trump's threats around the Panama Canal. claiming falsely that the Chinese are running the Panama Canal, right? Which is not true, but in any event, there is a greater Chinese presence in Latin America. They're investing a lot in many countries there, and I think the national security establishment in the United States is not at all pleased about that. And similar, if maybe somewhat less dynamics in Southeast Asia and in Africa. The relationship with Europe is also very complicated, and I think Europe moved more towards the American position of confrontation with China under the Biden administration. But Trump is, of course, much more hostile to Europe, possibly hostile to NATO. This Greenland business, of course, Europe is not going to like it if America is militarily threatening what is in essence a European country. So, all that is very difficult to predict how it'll go down.
So I think you've been very helpful in illuminating these areas of economic competition and geopolitical conflict. These things then are talked about in ideological terms, both by the rulers of the US and by China's rulers. So I wanted you to now, if you could talk a little bit about how these things get framed, because that's what people, here, listeners will be hearing. On the part of the US government talks about the so-called rules-based international order. I mean, at least it did before Trump. We'll see how that shifts with Trump's ideology. But the U.S. has traditionally been criticizing China as a threat to that order. And for its part, then the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party has said that the rules-based international order is what they call power politics, and an attempt to impose the house rules of a few countries on the world. So can you talk a little bit about those ideologies and how they're related to the interests of the respective ruling classes?
Yeah, the rules-based international order is I don't even know how to phrase it. Impossible to uphold after the genocide in Gaza, and it's not like there was ever a rules-based international order under, let's at least say, since the end of the Cold War, which I think is when it really becomes kind of significant. But it's just impossible to maintain that pretense, I think, for anybody, including for Americans. After that, when it has become clear that regardless of what the world thinks, regardless of what the UN or the International Criminal Court thinks about that genocide, it is persisting, and it is persisting with the active support of the United States. So I think that it is a spent ideology, and so we shouldn't mourn it. That being said, whatever comes with Trump, with intensified nationalism in the America First agenda, with a kind of active disregard and willingness to be confrontational, not just with the traditional diplomatic or kind of military adversaries in China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, but also with American allies like Canada, like the EU, like with South Korea, whoever. I mean, it's extremely dangerous, but I think that we are in a position now where it is a bit of an ideological vacuum. In that context, you have the possibility for the emergence of this kind of ethnocentric America First policy, which is very, very dangerous. What is China's response to that? China's response to that is so their critique of the American system, I think, actually is fair, right? The United States wants to remain global supremacy. They want to be able to maintain the capacity to set the rules of how global capitalism functions, or to set rules and then to violate those rules kind of as the U.S. sees fit. So I think that critique is fair. In the same way that the State Department's critique of China as being a major human rights violator, is true, right? In a narrow sense, it is hard to take these respective parties all that seriously when you look at their own behavior, right? So we've already talked about the behavior of the United States with respect to Gaza. But if you look at China, the way that China will present itself is as engaging in win-win relations, which suggests a kind of reciprocity that does not reflect the reality of how Chinese corporations engage with countries in the global South. They also will invoke, usually not directly, but at least indirectly, the memory of third worldism and talk about themselves as being a former colonized country. China was colonized, but that doesn't mean that it is forever in solidarity with countries in the global south. And with respect to this question of kind of imperialism or national chauvinism or what have you, China is in conflict with a lot of countries on its border, and is seen as being expansionist. Now, it is not threatening to annex Greenland or an entire nation. But if you look at what's happened in the South China Sea over the last decade under Xi Jinping, they've been extremely aggressive in stating claim to this vast territory that has a lot of natural resources and gas, and it has brought them directly into conflict with plenty of other formerly colonized countries, most importantly the Philippines, right? And that has at some points been very, very tense, the relationship, and there have been confrontations between ships in the South China Sea over disputed islands. It has brought them into pretty intense conflict with Vietnam, Vietnam being the last country that China fought an active war with in the late 1970s. And Vietnam, they're not inviting American troop rotations in the way that the Philippines has, but has also tried to kind of pull closer to the United States to kind of balance off the power of China. There's, I just read in the newspaper that Indonesia is enhancing their military ties with Japan. Japan is also enhancing military ties with the Philippines. And China fought a little border skirmish with India a couple of years ago over a disputed territory in the Himalayas, which ended up resulting in dozens of Indian soldiers being killed. And so the relationship with India, I mean, in some ways, that's probably the second most important bilateral relationship that China has to deal with, is very, very, very tense. India doesn't want China in its assumed sphere of influence there, in particularly in the Indian Ocean. And that border dispute has been ongoing for many decades. China and India also fought a border war in the 1960s. And there's a lot of resentment, of course, with rising ethno-nationalism and patriotism, if somewhat more generously, under the semi-fascist BJP regime. And so, neither of those sides really want to back down from that. And so, so if you imagine China kind of presenting itself as this inheritor of third worldism, as understanding the country's position vis-a-vis Western imperialism and colonialism, well, they can do that at the rhetorical level, right? But if you look at their actions so far, it doesn't suggest a great respect for other countries' sovereignty, regardless of how much power they have. And so I think it requires, if not outright cynicism, we need to approach it with a great degree of skepticism.
So when we look into the future, of course, it's impossible to not also reckon with the deepening ecological crisis globally. And in China, rulers talk about developing what they call an ecological civilization, featuring the harmonious coexistence of man and nature. A 2021 government statement talked of adhering to the philosophy of ecological civilization. China will promote wide-ranging green transformation in its socioeconomic development and endeavor to achieve continuous environmental improvement. And there are some people, ecologists and ecological leftists around the world, who think this is admirable. So what's the ideology here, and what's the ecological reality of capitalism in China?
Yeah, so I'll come back to something I said earlier, which is just approaching the political rhetoric of the Chinese state with the same kind of skepticism we would with the United States, right? And so, you have politicians in the United States, including Joe Biden, talking about advancing green technology and things like that. China talks about ecological civilization. That sounds nice, and it's good. And we should approach it with some skepticism and to see concretely what they're doing. Now, I think that there are some very important and good things that the Chinese state has done. But the way that I think about it, if in the American context, we sometimes talk about the Green New Deal, which involves the ecological transformation as well as the social transformation. China is trying to get kind of the green part, but without the social part, right? So let me talk about that a little bit. First, the green part. You can see massive investments in green energy. And you can see that China is decarbonizing much faster, I think, than any country in the world. Through all kinds of technology, most importantly solar. They've really brought down the cost of solar panels, and that has changed not just the domestic market, but the ability of countries around the world to adopt solar and to make it effective, a economically viable replacement for fossil fuels. Now, there's a couple of caveats to that. One is that China's overall carbon emissions are still extremely high. They produce many more carbon emissions than the United States, not on a per capita basis. Of course, the United States is still per capita significantly higher, but still massive contribution to global carbon emissions. And I recently saw some data that looks at the historical trends. One thing that China justifiably says is, okay, you're trying to impose limitations on our carbon emissions, but Western countries got to develop for 150 years without any limitations. And if you look at historical contribution to carbon emissions, actually it's still Western countries and Japan that are overwhelmingly responsible. And that is true. But China has really closed the gap in a very short period of time, in the same way that their industrialization has been accelerated. Their carbon emissions and contributions to historical carbon emissions has also accelerated. So if the point at the sort of global civilizational level is to keep carbon out of the atmosphere, China is the world's largest emitter, and that does have to be brought down very, very quickly. And as their energy usage continues to go up now because of new things like AI and all that, the point is not just to, the introduction of green technology is not moving fast enough to actively and dramatically bring down overall carbon emissions, which is the thing that has to happen. So that's on the green side, and there've been impressive gains also in electric vehicle adoption. I don't remember the precise number, but they're ahead of most Western countries in that respect, and that's good. Of course, better would be to not have redesigned your cities in a way that encourage car usage, but that has already happened, and so there it is. Now, part of the problem, this comes back to where we started, thinking about China as a capitalist country. This whole process being driven in a marketized manner. The state is subsidizing a lot of the technology, but it's being done through private corporations. And so once you have these private corporations, there's a strong incentive for them to produce, to conquer new markets, and to reduce costs. So it's better to have an electric vehicle than to have a gas-powered vehicle. It's better to not have vehicles at all, right? And the production of a new BYD is still a very carbon-intensive process. And like I said, many cities have been redesigned in a way such that it's actually necessary now to own a car. So that was a mistake that they have made. BYD now has, of course, a necessity, an imperative to continue to produce more and more cars every year. And if they can't be absorbed within China, they're going to be absorbed in foreign markets, right? And that is going to continue to be an energy intensive process. Hopefully more of that energy can come from renewables rather than carbon emitting, but we'll have to see about that. The other big problem comes internally with how these corporations are organized. So they are competing in a market, and this is where we get to the social piece and why it's not a Green New Deal. It may be green. They have a strong imperative to reduce their business costs. And so they do this the old-fashioned way, by exploiting labor. And working for BYD is a bad job. There have been many reports of severe overwork. There have been examples of people who have suffered death from overwork. There were a number of suicides from BYD workers, which were attributed to the super intense work environment. When it comes to the production of solar panels, again, something that China leads the world in, there is extensive evidence about how they've gone about doing this, and it's for many companies, it's through the forced labor regime. There's this whole problem, which we haven't even gotten into, of the severe repression and colonial endeavors in northwestern China in the Xinjiang region. And one of the features of this is that these Muslim minorities, once they're put in concentration camps due to their religion, in order for them to get out, they have to agree to take essentially whatever job that the government arranges for them. And there is a lot of silicon production that happens out in Xinjiang. Once you're in one of these situations, if you don't really have the freedom to negotiate, right? Because if you leave the job or you create trouble for your employer on the job, you can be sent back to the camps. And this is extremely well documented, right? So, and then there's the other question about the natural resource extraction. And there's some, not great stories, particularly around cobalt and what cobalt extraction looks like in the DRC, what it looks like in Indonesia, subjecting the populations there to extreme danger and exploitative labor conditions. All of that undergirds the global competitiveness of those solar panels, of those EVs, et cetera. And so I think that essentially what you have is you have the state has invested a lot of money in developing these technologies because they want these new commodities. They want to conquer market share globally. They're not concerned with the social consequences of it. So I think for leftists, we can look at this and we can say, yeah, it's a positive development that China is reducing the sort of the carbon intensity as they talked about it. But if we believe that the green transformation also has to be a social transformation, that you have to address historical inequities, that you have to, pay people a decent wage, China is not doing that at all. And I think that that is a problem because those social problems, they're still there and they're going to come back to bite you one way or another.
I think it's also worth underlining that the shift towards renewables is much faster than the phase out of fossil fuels, right? Not just in China, but in the West and everywhere. And so we need to be looking at both sides of that when we think about ecological futures.
Yes, absolutely.
So then, as we move towards wrapping up, I want to ask you the more direct political question about the stance of the left in the West, in countries like Canada, the US, Britain, where most of the listeners of this podcast are, what stance we should take in response or in relation to the rivalry between the rulers of our countries and China's rulers. How would you suggest an orientation? And how might it be different than some of the pitfalls that people fall into around this?
Yeah, so, I think a lot of things are not complicated for the left, regardless of what particular current within the left you occupy. The most important thing for America and its associated allies is to ensure that we don't have a war with China. That is very, very important. And there are lots of possibilities, and we should not be preparing for a war. We should demand less military spending. We should demand a reduction in nuclear warheads, right? The kind of the most catastrophic potential outcome. These are things that are normal and we would be doing anyway. We would be doing them if we were only thinking about Palestine. But there's implications, of course, I think, for how we engage with China as well. I also think that all of the other kind of social problems that we're generally attentive to, right? Racism, the class inequalities. This is going to be the sort of the most important thing in the day-to-day work of most leftists, most places around the world. And to the extent that we can address some of those problems internally and really clarify the fact that for all of our societies, the biggest threat, of course, is the kind of the internal dynamic and not the threat of like Chinese invasion. That will kind of make the argument that China presents this existential threat it'll stick a little bit less, right? Like the main problem Americans have is not that Xi Jinping is planning to invade. The main problem we have is that we can't pay the rent and we can't pay for health insurance, right? So, and I know, in Canada and Britain, maybe that's a little bit different, although you all have the health problems with the health systems too.
And with paying the rent.
And with paying the rent is universal, right? We're on the exact same page with that. So I think that's the most important thing. But of course it comes to geopolitics, and I think it is important to have a position that is rooted in our principles. And there's a lot of principles that the left has that I think are really not that controversial that we can use when we're thinking about China. And so, we're just talking about this question of the ecological transformation or transformation to renewables. Do we want this to be a socially progressive process, or are we willing to just say, well, this percentage of the population has to be sacrificed in the mines or in these exploitative labor conditions because this is the necessary thing for reducing carbon output? Well, I think we have a pretty clear answer on that. Like, no, we think these things have to go together. Is it okay to subject ethnic minorities or religious minorities to a regime of surveillance, of incarceration, et cetera, that we would not accept for the dominant race? Well, in America, it's very clear for us. If you're on the left, you're going to say, no, that's racist and we shouldn't be doing that. And with respect to China, I think that's important as well. Now, the big question, I think, for international leftists is always to think about how to build solidarity with people across borders, right? So how is it that working class and oppressed people from different countries can link up and can see that they actually share much more in common with each other than they do with their respective rulers? And that is extremely hard to do. And I don't want to sugarcoat that. Importantly, because the levels of political repression in China are so severe right now that even receiving phone calls and emails from the United States could put someone in China at risk. Even absent that kind of repression, building international solidarity famously is very, very, very difficult to do. One of the things that we talk about in the book, which I think is important, and this is an opportunity that I think exists regardless of whether you're in the United States or any other Anglophone country, there are a lot of Chinese immigrants and there are a lot of Chinese students. Now, the number has come down a little bit, I think, in recent years, but in the United States at the peak, we had about 350,000 Chinese students and 2 million, I'm not sure the exact number of Chinese immigrants living in the country. Those numbers are smaller in Canada and Britain, but as a percentage of the population may even be higher. And so, there are these communities that exist, and I think it's really important for non-Chinese members of the left to think about how to work with them and for that to be kind of a base of our political organizing for various reasons. One, to deal with the question of anti-Asian racism. We saw during COVID that became a huge problem in many countries around the world. Um, and it's a problem that is not going to go away. I mean, as we were facing the possibility of enhanced anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States and deportation, thinking about how to protect those communities as well, I think is quite important. But there's another feature to it, which is one of the things that I've been really excited about that I've seen in the United States, but also on a recent trip to London, is that you have the constitution of what you might think of as kind of left dissident communities among Chinese people overseas. So they can't do this kind of open organizing, political debate, writing, et cetera. They can't do that within China anymore because the space has become so constrained. But you can do it in New York or London or Toronto, these kinds of places, and there are very active communities. And that's significant not just for the political struggles in each of those respective countries, but for also thinking about how to affect politics back in China. Because the things that are happening in China, people in China are looking at things that are being said and written by the diaspora communities. And that can affect the political dynamics back within China. We saw this very clearly in the 2022, the movement, the so-called white paper movement, where you had big protests all over Chinese cities against the very strict and frankly discriminatory lockdown policies that they had there. There's a lot of dialogue happening between the diaspora communities and within China. And there's a historical precedent for this. In the Xinhai Revolution in 1911, which overthrew the Qing Empire, which was led by Sun Yat-sen, when that revolution kicked off, Sun Yat-sen was in Hawaii, right? And he was doing fundraising for the movement back in China. So this idea of the diaspora playing an important role in Chinese politics there's a big historical precedent for that, and I think it's something for us to learn from.
Thank you so much. But before you go, could you just make a bit more of a pitch to tell listeners about the book China and Global Capitalism and what it covers?
Yeah, so it's again it tries to be as comprehensive a book as possible while still not being exceedingly long. We wanted it to be the kind of thing that people might plausibly be able to read through. And we deal with a number of topics. We start with, as this conversation has, dealing with this question about China as a capitalist country, about its integration into global capitalism. And then we run through a number of major topics showing the political consequences of China's incorporation into global capitalism in terms of the inter-imperial rivalry with the United States, in terms of the dynamics of social unrest and labor unrest specifically, which is something that my co-author Kevin and I have spent a lot of time studying, as well as Rosa. We look at the different kinds of social struggles that are taking place within China aside from workers, including women's struggles, including movements by ethnic minorities. We look at environmental struggles. We deal with the pandemic. We started thinking about this book in kind of the depths of the pandemic, and so it was something that we really had to think about. And in some ways, maybe nobody wants to think about it anymore. But some of the dynamics that led to the intensification of the pandemic, the rapidity with which the virus spread around the world, and the inability of most countries to handle it in a humane way, those problems are still with us. And certainly the racist responses that we saw in many countries outside of China to that virus, that is very much still with us. And then we also look, as we were just discussing, at the role of Chinese diaspora, specifically in the United States. We do a little bit of a history of the Chinese American community and some of the social movements among Chinese Americans as way of kind of concluding and thinking about the state of Chinese people in the United States, and that as being a potential social base for building this international solidarity.
Thanks. Listeners will find a link to that book, how you can buy it, in the show notes for this episode. I'll also just say that if listeners are interested in hearing more about China, you could check out episode 11 of Victor's Children, which featured interviews with Ralph Ruckus and Vincent Wong, and also episode 33, where Ashley Smith and Kevin Lin, who are two of the co-authors of China and Global Capitalism, were interviewed as well. Eli Friedman, thanks so much.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.